alcohol has been around forever. It's that wonderful thing that happens when you get a combination of yeast and sugar. It ferments and produces alcohol. It can do it all on its own. Isn't that miraculous? It's great. But the trouble with fermented alcohol, wine or beer, whatever it is, if you don't look after it and store it carefully, it will go bad. And if you go back 500 years, water was not really a very dependable thing to drink. People didn't understand about hygiene and everything else, lots of waterborne diseases. And really, if you could afford it, it's much safer to drink alcohol. I stick to that rigidly. I'm pretty much a water freak, so but there's some truth there. Alcohol was safer, and water was just sort of flushing and things. People cooked with alcohol and they drank alcohol if they could afford it. But the trouble with fermented alcohol is, if you don't look after it, as I said, that would go bad, probably do more harm than water. So there's a problem here. By distilling the alcohol into a higher strength spirit, in other words, getting rid of the water, nasty stuff, you have something stronger and it doesn't go bad and it's kind of safer. And let's face it, has a more immediate effect as well. So distilling became popular fairly spontaneously across Europe. People distilling whatever they fermented locally into alcohol, and pretty crude. Look at this fellow, he doesn't look very happy. And whatever is really just putting something into a kettle and the vapor that comes off, condensing it back into a liquid and just drinking it as it was. No separation of alcohols, no maturation, pretty filthy. But the effect afterwards is probably slightly better, so they persevered. And gradually increased the distilling, improved rather the distilling technique, understood about maturation, understood about separating off the higher alcohols, which frankly do you no good, and evolved into the vodkas and the schnapps and the gins and the whiskies that we see very separately today. The Dutch were doing the same. Dutch were distilling fairly crudely into probably using rye as a material base, distilling it into alcohol. And what the Dutch did was to kind of hide the impurities and the bad tastes of the alcohol by adding a flavor. And the flavor they used was juniper, oil of juniper. Juniper because it was medicinal. And juniper oil is meant to be good for backaches and kidney complaints and all sorts of things like that. So a lot of the origins of alcohol and drinks are medicinal in their origin. So that's why we think James Burrow, who was a pharmacist, did a really good job of making gin. It was kind of in the mindset there. So the Dutch added juniper to disguise the bad... Stop it. That's okay so far. To disguise the bad taste of the alcohol. And the Dutch word for juniper is Geneva, and the English word gin is just an abbreviation there. So gin is about juniper. Geneva gins, of course, still very much around. Big Dutch influence in England in the early 1600s. I don't want to give a history lesson, but there's a thing called the 30 Years' War in Europe, when, usual thing, basically, the French and the Spanish had ganged up and tried to acquire the lands of Belgium and Holland, the Low Countries. And the English were allies of the Dutch, and they were trying to keep, again, the French and the Spanish out. We're doing this year after year after year. This is where I remind myself I work for a French company. But, so this is called the 30 Years' War. And these English soldiers were sent to fight, probably not knowing where they were or why, you know. They found solace, I think, in the local brew. And they found the gin, you bet. And they were given rations of gin to drink before going into battle. You know the expression Dutch courage? That's exactly where that comes from. It's to sort of fortify yourself. It's like the red snapper, really, isn't it? Just to start the day there. So they fought the wars, they came back to England, and they brought with them the recipes for gin. Pretty desperate times in the early 1600s. The barley harvest had failed, so no beer. The Scots were beginning to make what became the whiskey we know today, but the Scots were allies of the French, so that was no good. So poor Englishmen had nothing to drink in the middle. It's a sad story. So gin became very popular. People made their own gin in their own households, very crudely. Anything they could get ferment and flavour it with juniper if you're lucky. But all sorts of nasty things were used in those days, but cheaper to make than beer. So you get in the mid-1700s, this is not my favourite picture, Hogarth's drawing of Gin Lane. This is London about 1740. You can have a closer look, there's not a pretty picture.
Check it out, yeah, it's crazy.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, it's great. There's a chap here fighting the dog for the bone. The only two buildings that are not falling down are the pawnbroker and the undertaker, because they're going to a business. Everything else is in ruin. There's this fella hanging from a rafter. It's not a pretty picture, not my favourite picture. It's called Gin Lane. And this English artist, William Hogarth, drew this picture to depict the desperate results of the gin craze in London in the mid-1700s. 1740, they estimated that in London, in 1 year, they drank 11 million gallons. That's imperial gallons, so it's bigger than the US gallon. Is population 500,000? It's a lot of gin.
It's a lot of drinking.
This poor kid here is having it. You know, this is slightly overexposed. But it was pretty grim in those days. And the interesting thing is, this guy, William Hogarth, drew another picture called Beer Street. And Beer Street is all about happy, responsible drinkers drinking good old English ale and dancing around the Maypole, being polite to each other and helping old ladies on the seat in the bus and stuff. So it's a very anti-gin, pro-beer thing. And I don't know if you came in from Heathrow Airport, but you come into the city and you sort of turn left to come really right into the town. There's a big roundabout there called Hogarth Roundabout, because that's where he lived. And on the other side of that roundabout, there's a big brewery called Fuller's Brewery. You may have noticed it coming in. The brewers commissioned Hogarth to draw these two pictures. So pro-beer, anti-gin. The other thing it was by this time we've got a Dutch king, King William. And it was also saying, very political, are you pro the Dutch monarchy represented by gin, so in this case not, or the traditional English style represented by beer. King William put a tax on barley, so the brewers didn't like it, so that's what happened. But it doesn't excuse the fact that gin then was pretty miserable. Turpentine, all sorts of nasty things put in. So the government got concerned, as governments know how, and they tried to put a lid on the consumption of gin. And first thing, of course, they thought was, I know how to stop it, put a tax on it. But everyone making it at home, very inefficient to try and tax that. So the volumes were up and up. And then they panicked and they said, okay, no more gin. Gin is illegal. Like prohibition. My God, did we do it first? Anyway, it didn't work in our case. And there were riots in the streets when they tried to do that. And the shout that went out was, no gin, no king. We can't have Dutch gin, we don't have Dutch king either, send it back. So that didn't work, I'm pleased to relate. And the third thing they thought of actually worked, which was to license the gin distillers. About 1750s now. A license to make gin, £50, a huge amount of money. The sort of money you need now to buy a decent house in London. So the volume shot down to about 2.5 million cases from 11 million. But the distillers who had paid out all that money to get a license needed to get a return. And one way of doing that was to improve the quality of the product they were trying to sell. So gin began to get better. They took more care over how they made it. And it still wasn't quite a respectable drink. Smart people drank cognac or sherry or things like that. But gin became hugely popular. And the next great thing that happened was in the early 1800s, about 1820, when they invented the continuous still. What that did was to give us that nice, pure, neutral alcohol we saw earlier. Before then, everything was pot distilled. So all those, it's like raw whiskey, if you like, immature whiskey. base of botanicals just to mask it, really. Once you get neutral alcohol, this is where the gin distillers begin to establish their recipes, brands become established. And then we think of cocktails, gin really coming into its own as a world-class drink, and the rest is history. But this final picture, I'm pretty convinced that we are now, lucky us, living in the next great cocktail era. Yippee!